Have you ever been underestimated because of something you owned that was old? This 74-year-old farmer's response silenced 500 people. August 12th, 2023, Johnson County Fair, Iowa, Equipment Demonstration Day. The sun blazed overhead at 92 degrees heat, shimmering off acres of parked pickups and farm machinery arranged in precise rows like soldiers awaiting inspection. Brandon Fletcher owned the largest John Deere dealership in 3 counties, and he'd transformed the fairgrounds into a showroom that could have graced Des Moines. His centerpiece gleamed under portable spotlights, a brand-new John Deere 8R41, $485,000 of cutting-edge agricultural technology. 410 horsepower GPS guidance capable of maintaining rows within 2 centimeters of perfection, auto steer that could navigate a field while the operator checked email. Brandon stood before 200 farmers in designer jeans that cost more than most of their monthly fuel budgets, gesturing toward his gleaming green and yellow beast with the confidence of a man who'd never doubted his own importance. The pitch rolled off his tongue like honey over gravel. Gentlemen, this is the future of farming. 410 horsepower integrated technology, precision, agriculture capability. This tractor can accomplish in one day what used to require a week of back-breaking labor. Your grandfathers would weep with joy at machinery like this. Movement near the livestock barns caught his eye. Donald Mitchell walked past with his grandson heading toward the cattle pens, 74 years old, with hands gnarled from half a century of steering wheels and plow handles. He wore overalls he'd owned since 1987, faded denim that had survived more harvests than most of the men in Brandon's audience had completed in their entire lives. Brandon couldn't resist. The opportunity was too perfect, the crowd too large, the humiliation too delicious to pass up. Well, if it isn't Donald Mitchell. Folks, here's a man still farming like it's 1952, running equipment so old it belongs in a museum instead of a field. The crowd turned. 200 faces swiveled toward the old farmer like sunflowers tracking the sun. Donald stopped walking. His grandson Kenneth, 16 years old and already defensive of the man who'd taught him everything about working the land, put a hand on his grandfather's arm in warning. Brandon's smile widened, playing to the audience like a conductor before an orchestra. "Donald, you still running that ancient Farmall?" "What is it now, 70 years old?" The old farmer's voice came quiet, steady as bedrock. 71. Still runs fine." Laughter rippled through the crowd, not cruel, but dismissive. The sound of men who'd bought into Brandon's philosophy of constant upgrades and technological superiority. Brandon seized the moment, his voice rising with theatrical incredulity. "Still runs fine," he says. "Folks, this is what I'm competing against. Farmers who think a tractor from the Truman administration is adequate for modern agriculture. Donald, that museum piece might have been impressive when Harry Truman sat in the White House, but we've had 11 presidents since then. Maybe it's time to join the 21st century." Kenneth tugged harder on his grandfather's arm. "Grandpa, let's just go. This isn't worth it." But Donald was looking at Brandon with an expression that made the laughter die down, something in his weathered face that suggested bedrock meeting floodwater, immovable against inevitable. "That Farmall has plowed more acres than you've seen in your entire life, Brandon. More than you've sold, certainly more than you've worked yourself." The crowd went quiet. Everyone knew Brandon Fletcher had inherited his father's dealership 15 years ago and transformed it into a sales empire without ever getting his hands dirty in actual soil. He sold farming equipment the way other men sold luxury cars, with showmanship and pressure, and the constant implication that you weren't a real professional unless you bought the newest, most expensive option. Brandon's smile turned predatory. Maybe so, Donald, but I guarantee this John Deere here could outwork your antique any day of the week. Hell, it could probably outwork it in half a day. Someone in the crowd murmured anticipation, sensing conflict building like thunderheads on a summer horizon. The air felt electric, charged with possibility and testosterone and the eternal human hunger for competition. Donald's voice stayed level, but something had changed in his posture, a subtle straightening of the spine, a squaring of shoulders that made him seem taller despite his 74 years. You really believe that Brandon spread his hands wide, the gesture encompassing his gleaming tractor, his professional display, the entire philosophy of modern agricultural capitalism? I don't believe it, Donald. I know it. That's the difference between cutting-edge equipment and your junkyard special. The crowd leaned forward collectively, a single organism hungry for what came next. Donald let the silence stretch, let Brandon's words hang in the humid August air like smoke. You want to prove it? The question landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading outward through the assembled farmers. Brandon's eyes lit up with something ugly and triumphant, the look of a man who'd just been handed exactly what he wanted. What are you suggesting, old man? I'm suggesting we settle this. Your John Deere against my Farmall. Real competition, real field work. Let's see which one's actually superior for the work we're supposed to be doing. The crowd erupted in murmurs, phones already emerging from pockets as men began texting friends who weren't present, posting to Facebook, capturing video of what was rapidly becoming the most dramatic moment Johnson County had witnessed all year. Brandon looked at his gleaming $485,000 tractor, then back at Donald, and saw an opportunity to humiliate this stubborn relic in front of everyone who mattered. All right, you want competition. Let's make it worth everyone's time. We'll have a plowing contest, 40 acres each. Whoever finishes first with acceptable quality work wins the whole thing, a voice called from the crowd. What are we betting here? Brandon hadn't thought that far ahead, but he was committed now, adrenaline and hubris flowing through his veins like voltage through copper wire. How about this? Loser pays winner $10,000. The collective gasp was audible, sharp as ice cracking on a winter pond. $10,000 was real money, the kind of sum that could make or break a small operation that represented months of careful saving or years of debt. Kenneth grabbed his grandfather's arm hard enough to leave marks. Grandpa, we don't have $10,000. We can barely cover this year's seed costs. But Donald kept his eyes locked on Brandon, reading the younger man's face like he'd read soil conditions for 50 years, seeing the arrogance and certainty that would be his downfall. I don't need $10,000 to know my tractor will outwork yours, Brandon. Brandon's face flushed red. So you're backing out already. All that talk, and you can't back it up. Donald's next words came deliberate, each syllable weighted with meaning. I'm saying, let's make the bet worth something real. Loser pays $10,000 and admits publicly in front of this whole county that they were wrong, that the other person's equipment is genuinely superior for actual farming work. Brandon extended his hand before his brain could catch up with his mouth, testosterone and pride overriding caution. Deal. We'll do it next Saturday. Carl Johnson's got that 80-acre section that needs plowing. We'll each take 40 acres. First one done with quality work wins the whole thing. They shook hands and the crowd went absolutely wild. Phones blazed with activity, social media exploding with posts and shares and commentary. By sunset, everyone in Johnson County would know about the challenge. Donald Mitchell's 71-year-old Farmall M versus Brandon Fletcher's brand new $485,000 John Deere 8R41. Oh, the old farmer who could barely afford diesel versus the wealthy dealer who sold million-dollar equipment packages to operations 10 times the size of Donald's 160 acres. The underdog everyone secretly loved versus the arrogant businessman everyone quietly resented. $10,000 on the line, plus public humiliation for whoever lost. The bet of the decade, maybe the century for Johnson County farming. People were already placing side bets before they'd even left the fairgrounds. The general consensus ran 95-5 in Brandon's favor. There was simply no conceivable way a tractor from 1952 could compete with modern machinery. Physics wouldn't allow it. Economics wouldn't support it. Common sense rejected it outright. But what that crowd didn't know was why these two men hated each other so deeply. It started with a betrayal worth $200,000. The hatred between Brandon Fletcher and Donald Mitchell stretched back 6 years to 2017 when Brandon had tried to buy Donald's 160 acres for development. A wealthy investor from Chicago wanted to build a housing subdivision, one of those cookie-cutter neighborhoods where every house looked identical and every lawn followed homeowners association regulations. Brandon was brokering the deal for a $200,000 commission, offering Donald $1.2 million for land that was only worth $800,000 on the agricultural market. Everyone in the county expected Donald to take it. He was 70. Then his wife Shirley had ongoing health issues that required expensive medication. They were barely scraping by on crop income that depended on weather and commodity prices and luck. Retirement with over $1 million would have solved every financial problem they faced, would have guaranteed comfort and security for whatever years remained. Donald had said no, had told Brandon that some things mattered more than money, that his father had bought this land in 1943. After returning from the Pacific Theater, that Donald had promised to keep it farming, that he'd rather die broke on his own land than rich in some retirement community watching television and waiting for death. Brandon had lost his mind. The commission would have been the largest single payday of his career, would have elevated his status among the investor class, would have opened doors to more lucrative deals. He'd called Donald a fool. An old man stuck in the past had told him he'd regret it when the bank took the farm anyway, when Shirley's medical bills piled higher than crop income could ever cover. Brandon had been right about one thing. Donald had almost lost the farm in 2019 when Shirley needed emergency surgery, and medical bills piled up faster than crop income could cover them. Donald had been 60 days from foreclosure when he'd done something desperate, something that still made his chest tight when he thought about it. He'd sold every piece of equipment he owned except the Farmall M, every tractor, every implement, every attachment he'd accumulated over 40 years of farming, liquidated a lifetime of careful acquisition for $47,000, which barely covered the medical debt, and bought him enough time to restructure his farm loan with terms that would keep him paying until he died. The Farmall M was all he had left because he'd bought it outright for cash in 1979 and nobody could take it from him. It was his free and clear, and he'd proven something that shocked everyone, including himself. He could farm 160 acres with one ancient tractor through sheer determination, knowledge, and perfectly maintained equipment. He'd done it for 4 years now, planting and harvesting and managing every operation with that 1952 Farmall M, working longer hours and smarter methods than farmers with 10 times his equipment inventory. Brandon had used this as ammunition, would tell customers at his dealership in a voice loud enough to carry. You want to end up like Donald Mitchell farming with a 70-year-old tractor because you can't afford anything else. Then don't invest in proper equipment. See where that gets you when your wife gets sick and the bank comes calling. The comments always got back to Donald. Would burn like acid in his chest because Brandon was using his hardship, which had been caused by saving his wife's life, as a sales tactic to shame other farmers into buying equipment they couldn't afford, turning Shirley's illness and Donald's desperate sacrifice into profit margin and commission checks. The Farmall M itself had become a legend in Johnson County, not because it was special or rare, but because of what Donald had accomplished with it. He'd bought it in 1979 from a widow whose husband had died of a heart attack in his fields, paid $800 for a tractor that hadn't run in 3 years. Everyone told him he'd wasted money on junk, that he should have put that cash towards something newer, something reliable. Donald had spent 6 months rebuilding it completely, had torn down the engine to the block, replaced gaskets and bearings, and anything worn, had learned every system and every part and every quirk that made this particular machine different from every other Farmall M ever manufactured. He'd maintained it religiously for 44 years, treating that tractor like a partner rather than a tool. The engine was original, never rebuilt, running on the same block that had been cast in 1952 at the International Harvester Factory in Rock Island, Illinois. But Donald had kept the oil changed every 100 hours. Without fail, the filters cleaned the cooling system, maintained the fuel system purged of water and debris. He'd treated that tractor with a respect that bordered on reverence, and it had rewarded him with reliability that new equipment couldn't match. Brandon's John Deere 8R41O, by contrast, was a $485,000 marvel of modern engineering that Brandon had never actually farmed with. He owned it as a demonstrator, used it for shows and promotions, let potential customers test, drive it around his dealership's practice field. But Brandon himself hadn't farmed in 15 years, had inherited his father's dealership, and turned it into a sales empire without ever getting his hands dirty in actual production agriculture. That was the fundamental difference between the two men. Donald knew farming. Brandon knew selling. Donald understood land and weather and the 1,000 variables that determined whether crops thrived or failed. Brandon understood profit margins and marketing psychology and the art of making people feel inadequate until they signed financing agreements. The community's reaction to the bet split along predictable lines. Younger farmers, the ones who'd bought new equipment from Brandon and believed in technology as the solution to every problem, thought Donald was going to get destroyed. They posted on Facebook about how the old man was finally going to learn that progress matters, that you can't compete with modern machinery using antiques, that there's a reason nobody farms with equipment from the 1950s anymore. Older farmers, the ones who remembered when Donald was young and farming with equipment that was advanced for its time, weren't so sure. They knew Donald's reputation for precision, knew he could squeeze more productivity out of that Farmall than seemed physically possible, knew that he'd survived 4 years farming with just that one tractor, which suggested he understood something about efficiency that the younger generation had forgotten. By Wednesday, 3 days before the competition, the county extension office had gotten so many calls asking about it that they'd officially sanctioned the event, brought in judges, established rules to prevent disputes. Both farmers would plow 40 acres of the same field, soil conditions identical. Quality would be judged on straightness of rows, within 2 inches of tolerance, consistency of depth, within 1 inch of variance, and uniformity of soil, turnover with no skipped sections. Time would be measured from first pass to last. Winner had to achieve both quality standards and finish first. If quality wasn't acceptable, time didn't matter. Brandon immediately hired a professional tractor operator named Gary Preston, a 35-year-old who'd won 3 state plowing competitions, figuring that the 8R410's technology, plus Gary's expertise, would be unbeatable. Donald would be operating the Farmall himself, 74 years old, with arthritic hands and a bad back, running a tractor with no power, steering, no cab, no suspension, no GPS, nothing but a seat and a steering wheel and 71 years of engineering. When people asked if he was worried about the physical demands of operating that tractor for however many hours it would take to plow 40 acres, Donald just said he'd been doing it for 44 years and thought he could manage one more day. But privately, alone in his shed at night, with only the Farmall for company, Donald knew the truth. This wasn't about the tractor anymore. It was about proving that wisdom and experience and careful maintenance mattered more than horsepower and technology. It was about showing Brandon and everyone like him that farming wasn't just about buying the newest equipment, that it was about understanding the land and the work and the tools. And if Donald lost, if that Farmall couldn't compete, then Brandon would be right. The old ways would be proven obsolete, and Donald's entire life philosophy would be invalidated in front of the whole county. Everything his father had taught him, everything he'd learned through 50 years of working the soil, would be dismissed as nostalgia and stubbornness and the delusions of a man too poor and too proud to adapt. The financial stakes were real. Donald's bank account held $3,847. If he lost $10,000, the farm would go to the bank within 60 days. Shirley knew it had said as much over breakfast that Monday morning. "Donald, we can't afford this. If you lose, we lose everything." Her hand shook as she poured coffee, the tremor that had started after her surgery and never quite gone away. Donald had reached across the table and steadied her hands with his own calloused palms, rough against her soft skin. "We can't afford not to do this, Ellie. Brandon's been telling everyone for 6 years that I'm a failure, that my way of farming is outdated, that the only reason I'm still using the Farmall is because I'm too broke to buy something better. If I don't stand up to him now, that becomes the truth everyone believes. But what if you really can't win? What if he's right, and that tractor genuinely can't compete? Then we'll lose the farm, and I'll have been wrong about everything." "But I don't think I'm wrong, Ellie. I think I know something. Brandon's forgotten something that matters more than horsepower or GPS or spending $500,000 on machinery. What's that? That farming isn't about the equipment, it's about the farmer. Kenneth spent every afternoon that week in the shed watching his grandfather prepare, asking questions, learning in a way that school had never taught him. Finally, on Thursday, he asked the question that had been bothering him since Saturday. Grandpa, everyone says Brandon's going to win because his tractor has so much more power. How are you going to beat him? Donald was adjusting the clutch mechanism, his hands covered in grease, that had worked into the creases of his palms until it seemed permanent. He didn't look up from the work, but his voice carried the patience of a man who'd spent decades teaching. Kenneth, you know what the biggest advantage of new equipment is horsepower. That's what people think. But no. The biggest advantage is that everything is designed to be easy. Power steering so you don't have to work to turn. Suspension so you don't feel the bumps. GPS so you don't have to think about keeping rows straight. Climate-controlled cab so you're comfortable no matter the weather. It's all designed to make farming easier, to reduce the skill required from the operator. He straightened up, wiped his hands on a rag that had been white sometime in the previous century. And that's fine, that's progress. But it also means the operator doesn't have to be as good. The tractor does the thinking for them. Brandon hired Gary Preston to run his tractor. Gary's won competitions. He's a skilled operator, but he's used to letting the technology do half the work. Donald gestured at the Farmall M, its faded red paint and worn seat and gauges that didn't all work anymore. My Farmall doesn't have any of that. No power steering, no GPS, no automatic anything. Which means I have to be better than Gary, have to think ahead, plan every pass, maintain perfect depth and spacing by feel and experience. And that's my advantage. I've been doing this for 50 years. I know this tractor so well, it's like an extension of my body. He walked around the tractor running his hand along the hood the way another man might touch a beloved dog. I can feel when the engine's working too hard, can tell by the sound when the plow depth is off by an inch, can keep perfectly straight rows without GPS because I've learned to use landmarks and muscle memory and feel. That's what Gary won't have, can't have, because he's only been operating that particular John Deere for 3 days. Kenneth still looked skeptical. But Grandpa Brandon's tractor is 10 times more powerful. Even if you're better at operating, won't he just finish way faster? Donald smiled, and it was the smile of a man holding pocket aces in a poker game where everyone else thought he had nothing. Power isn't everything, son. In fact, sometimes it's a disadvantage. Brandon's tractor has so much horsepower that Gary can run it at maximum speed without thinking about efficiency. He'll probably plow at 7 or 8 miles per hour. Looks impressive, gets the work done fast. But here's what he won't be thinking about. He pulled out a piece of paper where he'd done calculations in cramped handwriting numbers and equations that represented 44 years of accumulated knowledge. Fuel consumption. That 8R410 burns about 12 gallons per hour under heavy load. My Farmall burns 1.5 gallons per hour. Now I'll be moving slower, probably 3 miles per hour, but I'll be running all day on 1 tank of fuel while Gary has to stop and refuel multiple times. And every time he stops, I'm still moving. Donald pointed at the calculations. I figured Gary will need to refuel at least 4 times to finish 40 acres. Each refuel takes 15 to 20 minutes when you account for stopping, positioning the fuel truck pumping, restarting, getting back to speed. That's over an hour of downtime total. Meanwhile, I'll run straight through on my 40-gallon tank." He looked at Kenneth with an intensity that made the boy stand straighter. And that's before we account for the fact that Gary doesn't know Carl Johnson's field like I do. I've plowed that 80-acre section probably 50 times over the last 40 years. I know where the wet spots are, where the ground is harder, where there's a slight rise that affects drainage. I know the northeast corner has clay soil that needs to be plowed shallower or you'll bring up too much hardpan. I know the southwest section has better loam that can handle deeper plowing. Gary doesn't know any of that. He'll plow everything at the same depth because that's what the GPS tells him to do, and his work will be technically adequate but not optimal. While I'll be adjusting depth and speed constantly based on conditions I've learned over decades. That's the difference between operating equipment and understanding farming. Kenneth absorbed this in silence, watching his grandfather work with a new appreciation for the thought and experience behind every movement. Finally, he asked one more question. "Are you scared?" Donald was quiet for a long moment, considering honesty versus bravado. Finally, he settled on truth. Terrified. If I'm wrong, if that Farmall can't compete, I lose everything. The farm, my reputation, proof that my whole way of life was a mistake. But being scared doesn't mean being uncertain. I know what I know, Kenneth. I know this tractor. I know that field. I know farming. That has to be enough. Across town at Fletcher Farm Equipment, Brandon was doing the opposite of preparing. He was celebrating early, had invited friends over to his dealership Thursday night to show off the 8R410, letting them sit in the cab and experience the technology firsthand. Honestly, I almost feel bad for the old man, but he challenged me. He made it public, and I'm going to teach him and everyone watching that there's a reason we don't farm with 70-year-old equipment anymore. This isn't nostalgia or tradition or respecting the past. This is reality, and reality says better technology wins every single time. Gary Preston was more cautious, had been around farming long enough to have heard stories about Donald Mitchell, about the impossible things he'd accomplished with that ancient Farmall. "Mr. Fletcher, I've heard the old-timers talk. They say Donald can make that tractor do things that shouldn't be possible. They say he knows soil and timing and efficiency better than anyone in 3 counties. Brandon waved him off with the confidence of a man who'd never seriously doubted his own superiority. "Those are just stories, Gary. Old-timers romanticizing the past because they're bitter about being left behind by progress. You're in a 410-horsepower tractor with GPS guidance and auto steer and every technological advantage money can buy. He's in a 38-horsepower antique with no technology at all. This isn't even going to be close. We'll finish by 1:30. Donald will still be out there at 4, and everyone will finally understand that success in farming requires investment in modern equipment." But Friday night, the evening before the competition, Brandon couldn't sleep. He lay in bed in his expensive house with its cathedral ceilings and granite countertops, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the way Donald had smiled when accepting the challenge. The confidence in the old man's voice, the fact that Donald had somehow farmed 160 acres for 4 years with just that one tractor, which suggested maybe, possibly, he knew something Brandon didn't. And for the first time since making the bet, Brandon felt a flutter of doubt in his stomach, a small voice asking, "What if you're wrong? What if there's more to farming than horsepower and technology? What if you just bet $10,000 and your reputation on assumptions that are about to be proven false in front of the entire county. He pushed the doubt away, rolled over, tried to sleep. But the question lingered like smoke in a closed room, impossible to fully dispel. What if Donald Mitchell actually knew something worth knowing? Saturday, August 19th, 2023, dawned clear and hot. Temperature already 78 degrees by 6 in the morning when pickups started rolling into Carl Johnson's farm, dust rising from gravel roads like smoke signals announcing something historic about to unfold. By 7:30, when the competition was scheduled to start over, 500 people lined the field perimeter, farmers who'd driven from 3 counties away, families with children sitting on tailgates eating breakfast, sandwiches, news crews from 2 local stations setting up cameras and microphones. Donald arrived at 7:15 in his rust-pocked Ford Ranger, towing the Farmall M on a small flatbed trailer that had seen better decades. The crowd's reaction split down generational lines. Older farmers applauded, appreciating the underdog spirit, the stubborn refusal to modernize that they recognized in themselves. Younger farmers laughed or shook their heads because next to Brandon's gleaming John Deere 8R410, which had arrived on a professional equipment trailer at 7 Sharp Donald's rig, looked like something archaeologists might excavate from a museum basement. The tractors were positioned at opposite ends of the 80-acre field. Each would plow 40 acres, working toward the middle soil conditions. Identical weather, identical pressure, identical, except for what each man brought inside himself. Judges had marked the boundary line with orange flags every 50 feet, a bright division between territories that would soon reveal which philosophy prevailed. Brandon stood beside his John Deere, wearing designer sunglasses that cost more than Donald spent on groceries in 3 months talking to Gary Preston, who was already in the cab familiarizing himself with the controls. A reporter from the Iowa County Times approached with a microphone, asking if Brandon felt confident. The smile was pure arrogance, untouched by doubt or humility. "I'm not confident, Rebecca. I'm certain. That Farmall is a museum piece. This will be over by lunch, maybe earlier, if Gary really pushes the pace." Donald sat on his Farmall's worn metal seat, doing what he'd done for 44 years, before every job running through a mental checklist that had become as automatic as breathing. Oil pressure gauge showing normal, range check. Engine rhythm, smooth and consistent check. Clutch engagement clean with no slippage check. Hydraulic response immediate when he tested the plow lift check. Everything functioning exactly as it should because he'd spent the week ensuring perfection in every system that mattered. Shirley came over with a thermos of coffee, her hand still trembling slightly from the surgery aftermath that never quite healed completely. She didn't say anything about the stakes or the risk or the $10,000 they didn't have, just looked at him with eyes that had seen 50 years of his stubbornness and determination and occasional foolishness. "Don't worry, Ellie. I know what I'm doing." At 7:50, the head judge, Robert Mills, gathered both operators for final instructions. Gary climbed down from the John Deere's climate-controlled cab, looking professional in work clothes that were clean and new, the outfit of someone who operated equipment for competitions rather than survival. Donald remained seated on the Farmall, 74 years old, and ready to work the way he'd worked every season since before Gary Preston was born. "Are we limited on speed?" Robert shook his head. "No speed limits, but remember, quality matters as much as time. If your work doesn't meet standards, Finishing first means nothing. We'll be inspecting depth consistency, row straightness, soil, turnover, uniformity. Technical adequacy isn't enough. We're judging optimal farming practice. At exactly 8 o'clock, Robert raised a starting pistol toward the cloudless Iowa sky and fired. The crowd's roar was immediate, visceral, 500 voices cheering and shouting as both tractors lurched into motion. Gary immediately pushed the John Deere to 7 miles per hour. The massive machine tearing through virgin soil with its 6-bottom plow, turning earth in wide, impressive swaths. GPS guidance kept the rows, laser-straight auto depth control maintained exactly 10 inches of penetration, the whole operation running with the precision of a Swiss watch and the power of a locomotive. The crowd watching Brandon's section gasped at the sheer force and speed at technology, demonstrating its superiority so dramatically that arguments seemed futile before they even began. By the time Donald completed his first pass at a methodical 3 miles per hour with his 2-bottom plow, turning much narrower strips, Gary had completed 2 full passes and was starting his third. Brandon stood with a group of dealers and customers, pointing at the 2 tractors with theatrical certainty. See that Gary's already done twice as much work. This is exactly what I've been trying to explain to people for 20 years. Modern equipment isn't just better, it's exponentially better. The difference between success and failure in contemporary agriculture. By 9 o'clock, Gary had completed roughly a quarter of his 40 acres, while Donald had completed maybe an eighth. The math looked brutal, insurmountable. If the pace continued, Gary would finish around 1 in the afternoon, while Donald wouldn't complete his section until 4 or later. People were already pulling out phones to post on social media about how the competition was exactly what everyone expected, a total mismatch proof that nostalgia couldn't compete with progress. But 3 people in that crowd weren't convinced the outcome was predetermined. Larry Roberts had farmed neighboring land for 30 years, knew Carl Johnson's 80 acres better than most people knew their own backyards. He stood near the judge's table, watching Donald's passes with narrowed eyes, seeing something the casual observers missed entirely. Donald was adjusting his depth constantly, plowing deeper in the loose soil sections where organic matter accumulated shallower, where the ground turned harder. Maintaining perfect consistency in the actual soil turnover, even though the plow depth varied by 3 inches across different areas. That takes skill you can't buy at any dealership. That takes knowing the land like you know your own body. Jonathan Hayes stood 50 feet away, also watching Donald's technique with professional appreciation. He'd farmed next to this field for 3 decades, had plowed it himself on contract work twice in the last 10 years. He knew the northeast corner had clay subsoil that sat about 9 inches down, knew that plowing too deep there would bring up hardpan that would ruin drainage for years, knew the southwest section had good loam that could handle 11 or 12 inches without problems. Gary's plowing everything at exactly 10 inches because that's what his GPS is programmed for. Uniform depth regardless of soil type. Technically correct but agriculturally ignorant. Donald's adapting every 50 feet based on knowledge Gary doesn't have and can't download from any satellite. Rebecca Morrison stood with her camera operator, filming both sections, narrating for the newspaper's social media followers. To casual viewers, it looked like Brandon was winning decisively. But Rebecca had been covering agriculture long enough to recognize expertise when she saw it. She zoomed in on Donald's face, saw the concentration there, the way his whole being focused on the work with an intensity that suggested this was more than competition. This was vindication or destruction with no middle ground available. At 9:42, Gary's fuel tank ran dry. The John Deere coughed, sputtered, died in the middle of a pass. Brandon's crew had a fuel truck ready, drove it onto the field with practiced efficiency, positioned it alongside the massive tractor. The refueling process took 18 minutes because they had to pump 150 gallons, had to ensure no air got into the lines, had to restart the systems, and verify everything functioned properly before Gary could resume. During those 18 minutes, Donald never stopped, kept plowing at his steady 3 miles per hour, the Farmall M's engine purring with the consistency of a machine that had been maintained to perfection for 44 years. The gap that had seemed insurmountable started to shrink, not dramatically, but measurably. Gary was still ahead, significantly ahead, but not by the margin his raw speed suggested he should maintain. By 10:30, Gary had completed 35% of his section, while Donald had reached 22%. Still behind, still the underdog, but the numbers were shifting in ways that made the mathematically inclined spectators recalculate their assumptions. The temperature climbed toward 90 degrees, then past it, heat radiating off the turned earth in visible waves that made the horizon shimmer like water. Gary sat in his climate-controlled cab temperature, regulated to 72 degrees air conditioning, humming radio, playing country music stations to pass the time. Comfortable as if he were driving to the grocery store rather than operating heavy machinery in intense competition. Donald sat on his open seat with sun beating down like physical weight, sweat soaking through his shirt, making his hands slippery on the steering wheel that required constant correction without power, steering to assist. No suspension meant every bump and rut transmitted directly through the seat into his spine, into his already aching back that protested every hour of continuous operation. But his focus never wavered, never diluted, remained absolute in ways that Gary's comfort actually prevented. Kenneth brought water during a brief moment when Donald reached the field edge for a turning maneuver. His grandfather's face was red from sun and heat, his hands cramped from gripping the wheel for 3.5 hours without break, his whole body radiating exhaustion that went beyond physical into something approaching spiritual depletion. "Grandpa, you okay? You need to stop rest for a few minutes." Donald drank half the water bottle in one long pull, poured the rest over his head, let it soak into his hair and run down his neck. His voice came hoarse but steady. "I'm fine, son. This is what farming feels like when you can't afford the luxury of air conditioning and power steering. This is what your great-grandfather did every season of his life. If he could do it, so can I." At 11:38, Gary stopped for his second refueling. Brandon's crew had the process down more efficiently, now completed it in 16 minutes instead of 18. But that was still 16 minutes of Donald continuing forward, still adding distance covered while the John Deere sat motionless, burning no fuel and plowing no earth. Gary had reached 58% complete. Donald had climbed to 35%. The crowd's mood shifted from certainty to speculation, from dismissal to genuine curiosity about whether the old farmer might actually make this competitive instead of embarrassing. Larry Roberts walked Gary's completed section during this refueling stop, examined the work with professional scrutiny that came from 50 years of farming experience. He kicked at the turned soil, probed it with his boot heel, bent down to examine the texture and composition. In the northeast corner, where clay subsoil lurked 9 inches below the surface, Gary's uniform 10-inch plowing had brought up excessive clay, mixing it with the topsoil in ratios that would cause drainage problems within 2 growing seasons. He found Robert Mills standing near the judge's table, making notes on a clipboard. "Bob, you need to look at this. The northeast section, Gary brought up too much clay." Robert walked over, examined the soil himself, made additional notes without commenting. He'd been judging agricultural competitions for 15 years, had seen every variation of technique and outcome. But something about this particular contest made him uneasy. The official rules were clear quality and time both mattered. Winner needed acceptable standards in both categories. But those rules left enormous room for interpretation about what constituted acceptable versus optimal, about whether technical adequacy sufficed, or whether true farming excellence required something deeper. He walked Donald's completed 35%, next examined it with the same professional scrutiny. What he found surprised him enough that he went back to his truck for a soil probe, wanted objective measurements instead of subjective impressions. The depth varied from 8 inches in the clay areas to 11 inches in the loam, but the soil turnover was uniformly excellent across every variation. Donald had somehow adjusted for conditions, continuously maintaining perfect quality despite constantly changing his technique based on knowledge rather than programming. Robert made extensive notes, said nothing to anyone about his findings, knew that premature commentary would bias the crowd and create controversy before official results were announced. At noon, with the sun blazing at 95 degrees and humidity making the air feel thick enough to chew, Gary had reached 70% complete. Donald had climbed to 55%. The gap was closing, mathematically undeniable, now the underdog gaining ground through factors that raw horsepower couldn't overcome. Fuel efficiency that allowed continuous operation versus power that demanded frequent refueling stops. Knowledge that enabled optimal technique versus technology that enforced uniform adequacy. Brandon paced near his dealership tent, no longer celebrating, no longer posting confident updates to social media. He watched the percentages shift, watched Donald's steady progress contrast with Gary's interrupted bursts, and felt the first real seeds of doubt taking root in his chest. He'd bet $10,000 he didn't particularly need, but couldn't afford to lose without social consequences. More importantly, he'd bet his reputation, his credibility, his entire philosophy of modern agricultural practice. If Donald won, if that 71-year-old Farmall actually outperformed his $485,000 John Deere, the implications went far beyond one contest. It would validate everything Brandon had mocked for 6 years, would prove that his sales tactics had been based on incomplete understanding, would suggest that perhaps forcing farmers into equipment debt wasn't the only path to success. At 12:30, Gary stopped for his third refueling. 14 minutes this time, the crew having perfected their process. He sat at 85% complete, would clearly finish before Donald. But the margin kept shrinking in ways that made the outcome less certain than it had appeared 6 hours earlier. Donald was at 68%, pushing himself and the Farmall to limits that worried Shirley, watching from the sideline. She'd seen her husband work through pain and exhaustion before, had watched him harvest crops with broken ribs, and plant fields with the flu. But she'd never seen him push quite this hard, never seen this level of determination bordering on obsession. Kenneth stood beside her, watching his grandfather with a mixture of pride and concern. He's going to hurt himself. 74 years old, no brakes, no shade operating that tractor for 6 hours straight. His body can't take much more. Shirley's voice came quiet, resigned to realities she'd accepted decades ago. Your grandfather is the most stubborn man in 3 counties. He'd rather die on that tractor than quit before he's proven what he set out to prove. We just have to trust that he knows his limits. But what if he doesn't? What if pride pushes him past what his body can handle? Then we'll deal with that when it happens. Right now, all we can do is watch and pray he makes it through. At 1:15 in the afternoon, Gary completed his final pass, shut down the John Deere 8R41. Oh, and climbed out of the cab with a triumphant fist pump that the crowd answered with enthusiastic applause. 5 hours and 15 minutes from start to finish, 40 acres plowed work, completed at a pace that seemed to validate every claim Brandon had ever made about modern equipment's superiority. Brandon was already celebrating, shaking Gary's hand, posting victory declarations on Facebook before official results were announced. Modern equipment wins every single time. 40 acres in 5 hours, 15 minutes. Donald still has 12 acres to go, probably 2 more hours minimum. This isn't even close. But Robert Mills was already walking Gary's completed section with his measuring wheel and soil probe, examining the work with methodical thoroughness that made Brandon's premature celebration seem premature and possibly premature in ways he didn't yet understand. Robert's expression grew more troubled with each measurement, each soil sample, each assessment of what Gary's technically adequate work had actually accomplished. The northeast section showed depth penetration of 12 inches in areas where clay subsoil sat at 9 inches, meaning Gary had brought up excessive hardpan that would create drainage problems and crop stress within 2 growing seasons. The southwest section showed depth inconsistency ranging from 9 to 11 inches, despite uniform soil conditions suggesting either equipment malfunction or operator inattention. 3 areas totaling approximately 7 acres displayed inadequate soil turnover. The earth flipped but not properly broken up, which would lead to clumping and poor seedbed preparation. Everything met minimum technical standards as defined in the rules, but nothing approached optimal farming practice, the kind of work that demonstrated genuine understanding of soil management and long-term field health. Donald continued plowing, still 28% to go, still moving, at his steady 3 miles per hour, still adjusting depth continuously based on conditions he'd memorized through 50 repetitions over 40 years. The Farmall EMS engine maintained the same rhythm it had started with 7 hours earlier. No strain, no overheating, no problems despite continuous operation under load in 95-degree heat. At 1:47, Donald reached 90% complete. At 2:20, he hit 95%. At 2:38, he started his final acres, the homestretch exhaustion radiating from every movement, but determination holding him upright on that worn metal seat. His hands could barely grip the steering wheel anymore, arthritis and cramping, making every correction an exercise in pain management. His back screamed protest at every bump and rut vertebrae compressed from 7 hours without suspension to absorb the constant jolting. His eyes burned from sun and sweat, and the concentration required to maintain precision when every muscle in his body demanded rest. Kenneth ran onto the field edge when Donald came near for a turning pass. "Grandpa, you're almost done. Just 2 more acres. You can do this." Donald's face was gray beneath the sunburn. His breathing labored, his whole body visibly trembling from exhaustion that went beyond physical into realms where will and stubbornness were the only forces preventing collapse. But his voice, when it came, still carried the bedrock certainty that had sustained him through 6 years of Brandon's mockery and 4 years of farming with inadequate equipment. "I know, son. Almost there. Just need to finish what I started." At 2:47 in the afternoon, Donald Mitchell completed his final pass, shut down the Farmall M, and slowly climbed down from the seat. His legs barely supported his weight, trembling so badly that Kenneth had to steady him to prevent collapse. 6 hours and 47 minutes of continuous operation, 40 acres, plowed work completed through sheer determination and knowledge that technology couldn't replicate or replace. The crowd gave him a standing ovation that lasted 3 full minutes, not because he'd won. Everyone assumed he'd lost by 90 minutes, but because he'd finished at all. Because a 74-year-old man had just plowed 40 acres on a 71-year-old tractor without quitting, without mechanical failure, without surrendering to the exhaustion that made younger men half his age look away in sympathetic pain. Brandon approached with a magnanimous smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, extending his hand with the confidence of a man certain he'd won despite the closer margin than anticipated. "Donald, I have to hand it to you. That old tractor held together better than anyone expected. You should be proud that you finished it all. Now, about that $10,000. The judges haven't announced a winner yet." Brandon's smile faltered, confusion replacing confidence. "Donald, I finished almost 2 hours before you. Time was part of the criteria. Everyone here witnessed it." Donald's breathing came hard, his whole body still shaking from exhaustion, but his voice remained steady as ancient bedrock beneath shifting soil. "So was quality, Brandon. Time and quality both. You heard Robert say it at the start. Acceptable quality in both categories determines the winner. Gary finished faster, I'll grant you that. But let's see what the judges say about quality before you start writing checks." Brandon's face went from confident to uncertain to something approaching worried. He looked toward Robert Mills, who was approaching with a clipboard and an expression that suggested this announcement wouldn't be simple or straightforward. "Gentlemen, we need to discuss the results." The crowd pressed closer, sensing drama, sensing that the outcome everyone had assumed might not be the outcome actually delivered. Phones emerged from pockets, cameras focusing 500 people holding their collective breath, waiting to hear whether technology or knowledge horsepower or skill modern investment or old wisdom would prevail when official judgment replaced assumption. Robert looked at both men, at the crowd surrounding them, at the 2 tractors sitting silent after 7 hours of competition that had somehow become about more than agriculture, had become about philosophy and economics and the question of what actually mattered in work that connected humans to earth and survival. "Mr. Fletcher, your operator completed the course in 5 hours 17 minutes. That's excellent time. Genuinely impressive speed for 40 acres. However, our quality inspection revealed several significant issues. Brandon's face drained of color, confidence evaporating like water on hot pavement. "What issues? Gary's work looks perfect. The rows are straight. The depth is consistent. The GPS ensured precision throughout. Robert consulted his notes, his voice taking on the careful neutrality of someone delivering news that wouldn't be well received. Your plow depth varied by 3 to 4 inches across different soil types. In the northeast section, where clay subsoil exists approximately 9 inches below surface, your operator plowed to 12 inches, bringing up excessive hardpan that will cause drainage problems and affect crop performance for several years. In the southwest section, depth ranged from 9 to 11 inches, despite uniform soil conditions, suggesting inconsistency in execution. We found 3 areas totaling approximately 7 acres where soil turnover was inadequate, earth flipped, but not properly broken up. But it was acceptable, wasn't it? The work met your minimum standards. Robert's pause carried weight that made the silence feel oppressive heavy, with implications that went beyond simple pass-fail evaluation. It met minimum technical standards as defined in the rules, yes, but the criteria explicitly stated that quality matters as much as time. Minimum adequacy isn't the same as optimal farming practice, and when we're judging which equipment is truly superior for actual agricultural work, we have to consider whether adequate is sufficient or whether excellence should be the standard. He turned to Donald, who stood swaying slightly from exhaustion, but upright through sheer stubborn will. "Mr. Mitchell, your time was 6 hours 47 minutes, considerably slower than Mr. Fletcher's operator. However, your quality inspection revealed something I've rarely seen in 15 years of judging these competitions." Donald said nothing, just waited too exhausted for hope or fear, just existing in the moment and accepting whatever judgment came. Your plow depth was consistent within half an inch across all 40 acres, despite soil conditions that varied significantly. You plowed 8 inches in the northeast clay section, 11 inches in the southwest loam section, and adjusted continuously between those extremes based on what each specific area required. Your rows are straight within half-inch tolerance without any GPS assistance. Your soil turnover is uniformly excellent across the entire section with 0 deficiencies or inadequate areas. Robert's voice carried professional respect that transcended competition or judgment. "Mr. Mitchell, I've judged plowing competitions across Iowa for 15 years. I've never seen work this precise. You somehow adjusted for every soil variation in this field, which suggests intimate knowledge of the land, combined with exceptional operational skill that goes far beyond technical proficiency into genuine mastery." The crowd stirred murmurs, rippling through 500 people as the implications began sinking in, as the assumed outcome started looking less certain. Robert continued addressing both men now. "There's one additional factor we observed during the competition. Fuel efficiency wasn't explicitly stated in the original rules, but it's worth noting for the overall assessment. Mr. Fletcher's tractor consumed approximately 78 gallons of diesel to complete 40 acres. Mr. Mitchell's tractor consumed 10.5 gallons. That's 7.4 times more fuel for the same amount of work." The crowd gasped, the math too stark to ignore, the difference too extreme to dismiss as irrelevant to farming economics and sustainability. Brandon's protest came desperate, his voice rising with the anger of someone watching certainty crumble into uncertainty. Fuel wasn't in the rules. This competition was about time and quality, not fuel costs. I won on time. The work met acceptable standards. Those were the criteria we agreed on. Robert's expression remained neutral, professional, but something in his eyes suggested he'd already made his decision and was simply working through the formality of announcement. Mr. Fletcher, you challenged Mr. Mitchell to prove which equipment was superior. We're judging which equipment performed better overall for actual farming work. Superior means considering all factors that matter in real agricultural practice, not just speed, not just technical adequacy, but optimal results, resource efficiency, and sustainable field management. Brandon opened his mouth to protest further, but Robert raised a hand, silencing him with judicial authority that came from years of making difficult decisions. The judges have conferred. Based on the totality of criteria, quality of work, time of completion, overall farming efficiency, and long-term field health implications, we have reached our decision. The crowd went absolutely silent, 500 people holding their breath. The only sound, the wind moving through corn rows in adjacent fields, and the distant call of crows overhead. The winner of this competition is Donald Mitchell. The crowd exploded, half cheering wily farmers who'd grown up with old equipment and felt vindicated by what they'd just witnessed, validation for every stubborn choice to maintain rather than replace, to learn rather than purchase. The other half stood in stunned silence. Younger operators who'd invested hundreds of thousands in modern machinery based on promises that technology solved everything, who now faced uncomfortable questions about whether they'd bought solutions to problems that didn't exist. Brandon Fletcher's face went through a transformation that 500 people would remember for years. Pale first blood draining away like water from a broken dam, then red flooding back with the force of humiliation compressed into rage, then purple oxygen deprivation from fury, so intense it choked rational thought. This is ridiculous. Time was in the criteria. We agreed on time and quality. I won decisively on time. The work met acceptable standards. You said. So yourself, I'm not paying $10,000 because of some technicality about fuel costs that weren't even mentioned in the original rules. Robert Mills stood his ground, clipboard held like a shield against Brandon's verbal assault voice, remaining calm with the practiced neutrality of someone who'd delivered unpopular verdicts before. Mr. Fletcher, you challenged Mr. Mitchell. You wanted to prove which equipment was better for actual farming. We judged which equipment performed better overall. Mr. Mitchell's 40 acres show higher quality work, used a fraction of the resources, and demonstrate sustainable field management that will benefit soil health for years. Yes, it took longer, but efficiency and precision more than compensate for the time difference. This is what good farming looks like, not just fast farming. Donald stepped forward, his movement drawing every eye in the crowd. His exhaustion so profound that each step looked like it might be his last, but his voice, when it came, carried quiet power that made Brandon's shouting seem hollow by contrast. Brandon. The single word cut through the noise, through 500 people's murmuring and speculation, through Brandon's building tirade, through everything except the fundamental confrontation that had been 6 years in the making. You challenged me because you wanted to prove old equipment is obsolete, that farmers like me are stuck in the past, that new technology is always superior, and the only path to success requires spending money we don't have on machinery we don't need. His breathing came labored sweat still dripping from his face, his entire body radiating exhaustion that went beyond physical into something approaching spiritual depletion. But his eyes never left Brandon's, never wavered, never blinked. But what you proved today is something different. You proved that farming isn't about horsepower or GPS or spending $500,000 on a tractor. It's about understanding your land, maintaining your equipment, working efficiently, and having the skill to do the job right. The crowd pressed closer, phones recording this moment, already going viral on social media platforms where millions would eventually watch an old farmer in sweat-soaked overalls deliver a philosophy lesson disguised as a victory speech. Your tractor is impressive, Brandon. 410 horsepower, every technological advantage money can buy. But Gary ran it like he was in a race instead of farming, plowed everything the same depth, regardless of soil conditions, burned through fuel like it was free, produced work that met minimum standards but wasn't optimal for the land's actual needs. Donald took another step closer, close enough now that Brandon could see the determination in his eyes, the bedrock certainty that came from 50 years of proving himself against odds that would have broken lesser men. My Farmall is 71 years old, cost me $800 44 years ago, and today it proved that with proper maintenance and operator skill, old equipment can not only compete with new equipment, it can beat it on the metrics that actually matter. Quality, efficiency, understanding the work you're doing instead of just doing it fast. The silence was absolute. Now 500 people barely breathing, waiting for what came next. So yes, Brandon, you owe me $10,000. But more importantly, you owe everyone here an apology for spending 6 years telling them the only way to farm successfully is to buy expensive new equipment from you, for using my wife's medical crisis as a sales tactic, for making farmers feel inadequate because they couldn't afford machinery that turns out they didn't actually need. Brandon stood speechless, face still purple, hands trembling with rage or humiliation or both. He pulled out his checkbook with movements that looked like they physically hurt, wrote out $10,000 with handwriting that shook enough to make the numbers barely legible, tore it from the book and thrust it toward Donald without meeting his eyes. The old farmer looked at the check, then at Brandon, then handed it to Shirley, who stood nearby with tears streaming down her face. Hospital bills. This pays what we couldn't afford when you were using our hardship to sell tractors to people who trusted you. Brandon turned and walked away, the crowd parting silently to let him through. No one speaking, no one meeting his eyes. His humiliation was too complete for mockery, too profound for celebration. This was devastation, the kind that would reshape his business and his reputation for years to come. Kenneth threw his arms around his grandfather, the boy's voice breaking with emotion Donald couldn't quite process through his exhaustion. "Grandpa, you did it. You actually won. We did it, son. That tractor and me together. 44 years of partnership, of maintenance, of understanding how machines work when you treat them right." Larry Roberts pushed through the crowd, grabbed Donald's hand, and shook it with fierce pride. "Your father would be so proud right now. Robert Crawford. Senior taught you to farm the right way, and you just proved his lessons still matter." That was when Donald's composure finally cracked, tears mixing with sweat on his weathered face, emotion overwhelming the exhaustion that had been holding everything else at bay. He'd proven what he set out to prove validated his father's teachings, demonstrated that knowledge mattered more than money. But the cost had been profound, the physical toll of 7 hours continuous operation, leaving him hollow and shaking. Jonathan Hayes appeared with a folding chair, practically forced Donald to sit before his legs gave out completely. You just taught every farmer here a lesson worth more than $10,000. That success comes from skill, not spending, from understanding your land instead of buying technology to replace that understanding. Rebecca Morrison materialized with her camera microphone, extended journalist instincts, recognizing a moment that transcended local interest into something with national implications. Mr. Mitchell, can I ask you a few questions for the Iowa County Times? Make it quick, Rebecca. I'm about ready to fall over. What made you so confident you could win when everyone else was certain you'd lose? Donald considered the question, his answer coming slow and thoughtful. I wasn't confident I'd win. I was confident I knew what I was doing. Confidence comes from knowledge, from experience, from understanding your equipment and your land well enough that you can adapt to conditions instead of just following programmed instructions. Gary Preston is a fine operator, won state competitions, knows how to run modern machinery. But he didn't know Carl Johnson's field, didn't know where the clay sits, where the drainage patterns run, where you need to adjust technique for optimal results. That knowledge is what won today, not the tractor. But your tractor is 71 years old. How is that possible? Donald almost smiled, exhaustion making even that small expression feel difficult. Because I've maintained it properly for 44 years. Equipment doesn't fail because it's old. It fails because it's neglected. That Farmall gets oil changes every 100 hours, regular maintenance on every system, careful attention to anything that might cause problems. I know that tractor better than most people know their own cars. When something sounds wrong, I can diagnose it by ear. When performance drops, I can feel it through the steering wheel. That's partnership, not just ownership. The interview became front-page news. Rebecca's article, "The Farmer Who Remembered How Knowledge Beat Technology," ran in the Iowa County Times that Wednesday, got picked up by the Des Moines Register on Thursday, hit the Associated Press wire by Friday. Within a week, 4 million people had read about the 74-year-old farmer who'd beaten modern machinery with a tractor older than most of their parents. Social media exploded beyond anything Johnson County had witnessed. The hashtag FarmallM trended number 3 nationally on Twitter for 18 hours. The YouTube video of Donald's speech accumulated 2.8 million views in 72 hours. National farming publications requested interviews, television morning shows called asking if Donald would appear as a guest agricultural equipment manufacturers, suddenly very interested in what this old farmer had to say about maintenance and sustainability. But the most significant impact was local, immediate, personal, in ways that statistics couldn't capture. Brandon Fletcher's dealership saw sales drop 25% in the first 10 days after the competition. 12 customers canceled pending orders, citing the competition as evidence they didn't need the newest, most expensive equipment after all. Comments flooded his Facebook business page. Farmers who'd been pressured into purchases they regretted, who'd gone into debt based on Brandon's assurances that success required constant upgrading, who now felt validated in their growing suspicion that they'd been sold more than they actually needed. Your equipment is fine, but after watching that competition, I don't trust your sales advice anymore. Donald Mitchell farmed circles around your demo operator using equipment that cost less than my monthly payment. Makes me wonder how much of what you've been telling us is actually true versus just sales tactics. The comment had 47 likes within an hour, spawned a thread of similar sentiments that Brandon couldn't delete without confirming the criticism's accuracy. His reputation, carefully built over 15 years, was crumbling faster than he could shore it up. Meanwhile, Donald's phone started ringing Tuesday morning and didn't stop for weeks. Farmers calling with questions about maintenance, about technique, about how to get more out of equipment they already owned instead of buying replacements they couldn't afford. Mr. Mitchell, I've got a 1978 International that's been sitting in my barn for 5 years. Everyone told me to junk it and buy new, but after watching what you did, I'm wondering if I should rebuild it instead. Can you teach me how Donald said yes to the first caller, yes to the 5th, yes to the 20th? By Saturday, he had 30 farmers showing up at his farm for an impromptu workshop, bringing tools and questions and equipment that supposedly couldn't be salvaged. He taught them compression testing, valve adjustment, carburetor rebuilding, all the skills he'd accumulated over 5 decades of refusing to replace what could be repaired. Kenneth helped demonstrate, had absorbed enough from watching his grandfather to explain procedures to men twice his age. Shirley provided lunch for 30 unexpected guests, sandwiches, and lemonade served in a barn that became an informal classroom where knowledge passed from generation to generation in ways agricultural colleges had stopped teaching. This became a regular occurrence. Every Saturday, 20 to 30 farmers appearing at Donald's farm, learning maintenance and technique, asking questions about soil management and efficiency, soaking up expertise that had almost been lost to the relentless pressure toward modernization and debt-financed equipment purchases. The Mitchell method became shorthand in Johnson County for farming that prioritized knowledge over spending, for maintaining equipment instead of replacing it, for understanding land conditions instead of relying on GPS to make decisions. It wasn't revolutionary, wasn't even new. It was just the old way of farming that had been nearly forgotten in the rush toward technological solutions. Wednesday after the competition, an unexpected visitor appeared at Donald's farm. Timothy Anderson, 32 years old, regional manager for John Deere, driving a company truck but carrying himself with the humble posture of someone who'd come to learn rather than sell. Mr. Mitchell, I need to talk to you about what happened Saturday. Donald was in his shed performing post-competition maintenance on the Farmall, checking for any damage from 7 hours of continuous operation, finding none because the machine had been prepared properly and operated within its capabilities. He didn't look up from his work, just kept wiping down the engine block with a clean rag. If you're here to argue about the results, save your breath. The judges made their decision, and I'm not interested in controversy. Timothy shook his head quickly, hands raised in placating gesture. No, sir, nothing like that. I'm here because I watched the video of your speech, watched it maybe 20 times, and I realized something that's been bothering me for years, but I couldn't articulate until I heard you explain it. He stepped closer, genuine curiosity replacing corporate polish. We've been selling technology without teaching people how to farm, selling GPS systems to operators who don't understand why row spacing matters, selling horsepower to people who don't know how to manage fuel efficiency, selling automation to replace skills instead of enhance them. And what you did Saturday, what you said in that speech, made me realize we're solving the wrong problems." Donald stopped wiping, turned to look at Timothy with eyes that had seen too many sales pitches to be easily impressed. "So, what are you proposing? That John Deere starts teaching farming instead of just selling tractors?" "Actually, yes. Would you consider consulting for us? Not selling, not promoting specific equipment, just teaching our operators and customers about soil management, about maintenance, about the fundamentals that make equipment effective, regardless of how new or expensive it is." The offer surprised Donald enough that he set down his rag, gave Timothy his full attention for the first time. Why would John Deere want that? Seems like teaching people to maintain old equipment instead of buying new would hurt your sales. Timothy's smile carried genuine conviction rather than sales polish. Short term, maybe? Long term, we build better relationships with customers who trust us to help them succeed rather than just sell them machinery. And honestly, after watching what happened with Fletcher's dealership losing customers because they felt pressured into purchases they didn't need, I think the industry needs to change direction before we completely destroy our credibility. Donald considered this, turning the offer over in his mind like examining a suspect bolt for weakness. "Only if you agree to one condition. You stop pressure selling equipment to farmers who can't afford it. Stop making people feel like failures if they're running older machinery that works fine. Stop prioritizing commission over actually helping people farm successfully. Deal. When can you start? Let me think about it. I'm 74 years old, just exhausted myself proving a point. Not sure I have the energy to take on corporate consulting work, but the seed was planted, the possibility taking root in Donald's mind that maybe his knowledge could reach beyond Johnson County, could influence how equipment manufacturers thought about their relationship with the farmers who bought their products. 3 months passed. November came to Iowa, with its characteristic gray skies and cold winds harvest, completed fields lying fallow until spring. Planting would begin the cycle again. Brandon Fletcher's dealership had hemorrhaged 40% of its business reputation, so damaged that farmers were driving 2 counties away to buy from competitors rather than deal with the man who'd been humiliated at the August competition. On a Tuesday afternoon, Brandon's truck appeared in Donald's driveway. Kenneth saw him first, immediately defensive, protective of his grandfather, who'd been working himself to exhaustion between his own farming and the Saturday workshops that had expanded to 50-plus attendees. "Grandpa, Mr. Fletcher's here. You want me to send him away?" Donald was in his shed performing routine maintenance on the Farmall, a task he did weekly, now despite the tractor sitting idle until spring. Maintenance schedules didn't pause for seasons, didn't care whether equipment was in active use or temporary storage. "No, let him come in. Whatever he wants to say, I'll listen." Brandon entered the shed looking diminished, smaller somehow than the arrogant dealer who'd stood beside his gleaming John Deere 3 months earlier. He wore work clothes instead of designer jeans, mud on his boots, suggesting he'd actually been doing physical labor rather than just selling it to others. "Donald, I need to talk to you." The old farmer kept his hands moving, cleaning the carburetor with careful attention that didn't pause for conversation. "You're talking. I'm listening. My business is dying. Sales down 40% in 3 months. 15 of my best customers won't return my calls. My reputation is destroyed. People drive past my dealership to buy from competitors 2 counties away because they don't trust me anymore. Donald offered no sympathy, no reassurance, just continued his work with the practiced movements of someone who'd performed this task hundreds of times and would perform it hundreds more. Brandon's voice came quieter now, ego stripped away by 3 months of consequences. I was wrong. About everything. Wrong about equipment. Wrong about you. Wrong about what actually matters in farming. I spent 15 years selling technology as a replacement for skill convincing people they needed to spend money they didn't have on solutions to problems that didn't exist. Finally, Donald stopped working, set down the carburetor parts, turned to face Brandon directly. "Why are you telling me this? You want forgiveness, want me to fix your reputation. Somehow, I'm not interested in helping the man who used my wife's illness to sell tractors." Brandon flinched, but didn't retreat. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking to learn, to understand how to farm the way you farm, to rebuild my business on helping people succeed instead of just taking their money." The silence stretched barn sounds, filling the space, wind through gaps in the siding, birds nesting in the rafters, the distant sound of Kenneth working on equipment in another section. Donald studied Brandon's face, looking for sincerity versus manipulation, for genuine change versus tactical adaptation to save a failing business. "You hurt me, Brandon. For 6 years, you used my hardship as your sales pitch, made my wife's medical crisis into ammunition for why farmers needed to buy expensive equipment, made my struggle into an object lesson in failure. Why should I help you now? Because I'm asking, not demanding, not expecting, just asking. And because if I can change, maybe other dealers will too. Maybe the industry shifts toward helping farmers instead of exploiting them. Maybe someone else's wife doesn't end up in the hospital while her husband sells everything he owns to pay the bills." Donald considered this the possibility that redemption might serve purposes larger than simple personal satisfaction. Finally, he nodded, decision made. "Be here Saturday, 6 in the morning. Bring work gloves and leave your ego at home. You'll learn by doing, not by watching. And if you ever use what I teach you to pressure farmers into purchases they don't need, I'll expose you worse than that competition did. I'll be here." "Thank you, Donald. I know I don't deserve this, but thank you." 6 months after the competition, Johnson County witnessed something nobody anticipated. Brandon Fletcher stood beside Donald Mitchell at the county extension office, announcing a partnership that made headlines in regional farming publications: Fletcher Mitchell Farm Equipment and Education. "We sell John Deere tractors, yes, but more importantly, we teach farmers how to use equipment they already own. Maintenance workshops twice weekly, soil management classes, technique training. We'll still help people buy new machinery when they genuinely need it, but our primary focus is teaching success rather than selling solutions." The dealership's new motto appeared on billboards throughout 3 counties: "We sell equipment. We teach farming." Profitability dropped 15% that first year as Brandon shifted focus from commission-driven sales to service-based relationships. But customer loyalty increased 300% referrals, replacing cold calls reputation, rebuilt on foundation of genuine help rather than predatory sales tactics. Donald taught 2 evening classes weekly at the dealership, showing farmers how to read their land, how to maintain equipment for decades instead of years, how to make informed decisions about when technology genuinely solved problems versus when it just created expensive dependencies. Kenneth, now 17, had been accepted to Iowa State University for agricultural engineering. His application essay described watching his grandfather compete against modern machinery, and Wynne described learning that engineering should serve farmers rather than replace them, described ambition to design equipment that enhanced human skill instead of substituting for it. Grandpa, I want to build tractors that work with farmers, not for them. Want to create technology that amplifies what people know instead of trying to think for them. Donald's pride was profound, bone deep, the knowledge that his grandson had absorbed lessons that would carry forward into generations he'd never meet. That's the future farming needs, Kenneth. Tools that make skilled people more effective, not tools that try to eliminate the need for skill. The Farmall M still ran perfectly now, 72 years old, 45 years with Donald, still performing every task asked of it because maintenance had never wavered, because respect for the machine generated reliability that outlasted any warranty modern manufacturers offered. August 19, 2024. 1 year exactly since the competition that changed Johnson County's approach to farming. The county fair's equipment demonstration day had been transformed, now focused less on selling and more on teaching, less on newest technology and more on sustainable practice. Donald's Farmall M sat on display next to Brandon's John Deere 8R410, positioned side by side with a sign between them that read, "Both have value. The operator makes the difference." Donald and Brandon presented together, former adversaries, now collaborators. Their joint demonstration, attended by over 300 farmers who came to learn rather than be sold to. This is my Farmall, bought for $800 in 1979. 45 years of partnership, of proper maintenance, of understanding that equipment only works as well as the person operating it. Brandon gestured to his gleaming John Deere humility, replacing the arrogance that had defined him a year earlier. This cost $485,000. It has tremendous capabilities, genuine technological advantages, but it's still just a tool. Success comes from the operator's knowledge, not the machine's horsepower. They demonstrated maintenance techniques, soil analysis procedures, decision-making frameworks for when technology genuinely helped versus when it created unnecessary complexity. The crowd asked questions, took notes, recorded videos to watch later, and share with neighbors who couldn't attend. Kenneth operated the Farmall, demonstrating the techniques his grandfather had taught him, showing younger farmers that 70-year-old equipment could still perform when maintained properly and operated skillfully. His commentary blended respect for tradition with understanding of modern engineering, creating bridge between generations that had been talking past each other for decades. Equipment doesn't matter nearly as much as we've been taught to believe. What matters is understanding your land, maintaining your tools, developing skills that make any machinery more effective. My grandfather proved that last August, and he's been teaching it every day since. Shirley watched from the shade of a vendor tent, tears in her eyes, but smile on her face, seeing her husband vindicated in ways that went beyond competition, results, or check deposits. He'd proven what he believed, taught what he knew, changed how an entire community thought about farming and equipment and the relationship between knowledge and success. Larry Roberts stood beside her, both of them watching the demonstration with satisfaction that came from witnessing wisdom valued instead of dismissed. Your husband changed this county, Shirley. made people remember that farming is about skill, not spending. That's a legacy worth more than any bank account. That evening, after the crowds dispersed and equipment was loaded back onto trailers, Donald sat on his Farmall in the small field behind his barn. Not working, not demonstrating, just sitting on the machine that had been his partner for 45 years, his connection to father and grandfather and generations who'd worked this land before modern machinery existed. Kenneth joined him, sitting on the old John Deere they'd restored together over winter months, grandfather and grandson both perched on machines, separated by decades but united by the understanding that tools served people, not the other way around. Shirley watched from the porch, knitting in her lap, smile on her weathered face. She'd worried that the competition would break her husband, that 7 hours of exhausting work at 74 would damage something that couldn't be repaired. Instead, it had validated everything he believed had given him purpose that extended beyond survival into teaching and legacy. Brandon's truck appeared unexpectedly, parking near the barn, the dealer emerging with the slightly hesitant posture of someone still uncertain about his welcome, despite 6 months of collaboration. He approached the fence line, didn't interrupt, just observed Donald and Kenneth farming in the golden light of August evening. Donald saw him shut down the Farmall, walked over with movements that still showed exhaustion from a long day of teaching and demonstrating. "You still coming to Saturday's workshop? We're covering transmission maintenance. Wouldn't miss it. I learned something new every week. Things my father tried to teach me before I decided selling was more profitable than understanding." They stood in comfortable silence, former enemies, now united by shared recognition that farming required more than machinery required knowledge, passed from generation to generation in ways no GPS system could replicate or replace. Makes you wonder how often we replace things we should repair, chase what's new instead of mastering what we have, judge people by what they own instead of what they know. The question hung in the evening air, rhetorical but profound, the kind of wisdom that comes from experience, rather than education, from failure, and redemption, rather than uninterrupted success. Kenneth climbed down from the John Deere, joined his grandfather and Brandon at the fence. 3 generations of farming philosophy compressed into one moment of quiet understanding. The boy spoke with certainty that came from watching his grandfather prove principles everyone else had dismissed. Same time, next Saturday, Mr. Fletcher, Grandpa's teaching me advanced carburetor rebuilding. Says if I understand how fuel delivery works, I'll be better engineer when I design new equipment. Brandon nodded, genuine eagerness replacing the forced enthusiasm that had characterized his selling years. I'll be here, 6 sharp work gloves ready to learn. Donald looked at his Farmall, at his grandson, at the man who'd been his enemy and become his student at land his father had bought in 1943 and that 3 generations had kept farming despite pressure to sell for development. The $10,000 from the competition had paid hospital bills, yes, but the real victory was this knowledge, valued skills, preserved understanding that success came from competence rather than consumption. The Farmall M sat silent in gathering darkness, red paint, faded seat-worn gauges, old but functional. Engine that would purr to life tomorrow morning when Donald climbed aboard for another day of work that connected him to soil and seasons and legacy that stretched backward through generations and forward into futures he'd never see but had helped shape. 72 years old, that machine, still doing what it was built for, still proving that maintenance and skill beat horsepower and price when operators understood what actually mattered. Have you ever been underestimated because of something you owned that was outdated? Or learned a skill from an older generation that proved more valuable than new technology? Share your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and some of these stories are just incredible, because maybe we've all been chasing shiny new solutions when what we really needed was the wisdom to maintain what already worked, the patience to learn from people who came before us, the humility to recognize that progress sometimes means remembering what we've forgotten rather than buying what we're sold.